In the summer of last year, the Russians were in possession of information they believed would be damaging to Secretary Clinton and helpful to the Trump campaign. Some of this information they stole from the computers at the DNC and elsewhere. In June, we now know that through intermediaries, the Russian government sought to approach the Trump campaign to see whether they would be interested in damaging information about Hillary Clinton. In late July, the president, quite out in the open, then candidate Trump, urged the Russians to hack Hillary Clinton's emails and said that they would be richly rewarded. During the course of our investigation, one of the questions we have sought to answer is, was there private activity by the campaign in parallel with the very public request that now President Trump, then candidate Trump, made for the Russians to hack and release Hillary Clinton information? Because we now know that the response that the president's son gave to the Russians was that he would love it if they would provide damaging information about Hillary Clinton. Rather than report this overture by the Russian government to provide damaging information to intervene in the presidential election in a way to help his father, neither the president's son nor the campaign reported this information to the FBI. When it became obvious that the emails were being dumped, when it became obvious this was being done by the Russian government, when our own intelligence community issued a statement in October affirming that this was being done by the Russians, did the Trump campaign then disclose that in fact they had received an overture to receive damaging information? The answer, of course, is no, they didn't. So this is obviously very significant, deeply disturbing new public information about direct contacts between the Russian government and its intermediaries and the very center of the Trump family, campaign, and organization. Obviously, we need to get to the bottom of exactly what happened, what was said in that meeting, any of the information that went into organizing that meeting, as well as if that meeting was just the beginning or that was a testing of the waters by the Russians to see whether the campaign would be receptive to their engagement and involvement in the presidential election. So this is, I think, a very key development in terms of what the public is aware of. Our work continues, so we are interviewing new witnesses each week, sometimes more than one each week. We'll be doing that until we get to the bottom of not only these additional facts, but all the others that we're exploring. And with that, I'd be happy to respond to your questions.
Congressman,
yes.
You mentioned that this seems to have been directed by the Russian government. Have you seen any evidence to say that this Russian lawyer was, in fact, directed by the Kremlin to meet with the Trump campaign? And secondly, have you seen any evidence of other meetings that may have occurred between Trump associates and Russians beyond this one?
I can't go beyond the four corners of what's already in the public domain, but I think that the emails themselves, which have now been verified by the Trump campaign itself, by the president's son himself, make very clear that government officials within the Russian government had information they thought was damaging to Secretary Clinton that they wanted to share with the campaign, and they made arrangements to provide a channel to do that, and this Russian advocate was that channel. Now, obviously, one of the things that we need to investigate did this just begin the conversation? Did she report that information, the receptivity to getting that information back to Moscow? Did Mr. Gladstone report back to the family that had approached him to say they would love to get this? And in fact, they would not only love to get it, they would love to get it late in the summer. And of course, it was late in the summer that the stolen emails began to be published. So these are the kind of questions that need to be answered. But here I think you have quite direct evidence that the Russian government had damaging information, communicated that to the campaign, and all of the campaign denials of whether we know this is going on or whether Russians had any involvement, whether the Russians wanted to help his campaign, obviously now have to be viewed in a completely different context.
Were you aware of this meeting?
Has the committee been in touch with Trump Jr. or his lawyer yet, and do you plan to request documents from him?
We will certainly want to have him come before the committee. I don't want to discuss any communications we're having with witnesses. They are free to disclose them themselves. We'll certainly want him to come in. We'll want everyone connected with this meeting to come in. Want any documents that they may have. Plainly, as we saw the constantly evolving stories from the president's son, we cannot rely on any public representations that are made by the family about their contacts with the Russians. We have now seen a very demonstrable pattern of obfuscation and dissembling about these meetings, originating with denials. We never had these meetings, then forced acknowledgement once the meetings were disclosed, and then a shifting explanation about what the meetings were about. In this case, the claim was this was about adoptions. And then it was, well, we brought the campaign manager. And it's significant to me that they invited the manager of the campaign. If this was not a campaign meeting, as they originally said, what was Paul Manafort doing there? But of course, the reason the Russians were approaching them was precisely because he was the apparent nominee at that point. So we're going to want to hear from everyone connected to this. We're also going to want to see, as referenced in that email, whether the president's assistant received any communication from the Russians as well. That was another channel that was alluded to in those emails.
Do you believe that this Russian lawyer was a dangle put out by the Russians to see how the Trump campaign would engage?
It certainly appears that way, that this is very much consistent with the Russian practices, with their essentially their operating procedures, where they will use civilians, they'll use often oligarchs, they'll use others, they'll look for relationships. And here, the emails, I think, make quite clear that the Russian government had possession of damaging information. They thought the way to get that to the Trump campaign to test whether Donald Trump wanted this information was to people he had done business with. And indeed, this is a modality the Russians use elsewhere. So who had they done business with? Well, they had done business with a gentleman that is known as the Russian Donald Trump, who had worked on the Miss Universe pageant, who had business discussions with the president over having a Trump Tower in Russia. So they go to this oligarch, they go to the son who knows the son of the now president. They find out, yes, there's a deep interest in this, and then they dispatch this advocate for the Kremlin. Now, why would they choose her? They might choose her because she gives them some deniability, as opposed to someone who has a more direct connection to the government. Obviously, this is something that we need to determine, but it would be consistent with Russian tradecraft to do exactly this.
Congressman,
yes.
Some of your colleagues are beginning to use the word treason. Even if you don't want to go that far or draw any conclusions yet, do you see possible violations of criminal law here, or is this just a breach of norms and etiquettes governing our democratic processes?
Well, it is absolutely not only a breach of norms, but a breach of civic responsibility to the country. If you get approached by a foreign government offering to interfere in a presidential election, you go to the FBI, you report it. That's what a decent citizen would do. And I don't want to see us continue to lower the bar here and say the only question is whether this is illegal. This was unethical. It was, I think, in violation of the oaths of citizenship to willingly solicit, receive, encourage foreign intervention in our elections. So this is a very serious business, whether criminal laws were violated or not. There are a number of criminal laws that are implicated here, and we see a kind of a shifting defense from the Trump administration. First, that there is no collusion, then there's, okay, if there is collusion, collusion's not against the law. The reality is conspiracy is against the law, and collusion is one form of conspiring. If there is a in-kind contribution of opposition research against their opponent, if there was any kind of quid pro quo, one of the messages that this Russian advocate may have taken back to Moscow is the Trump administration would be very amenable to repealing the Magnitsky Act. That is a piece of sanctions legislation that goes after Russians who are violating people's human rights. Was that a quid pro quo? Was it simply further encouragement of the Russians to intervene? Certainly they were getting all the right signals. They were getting the signals from the president then quite openly and overtly. They were getting signals from the president's son in a covert fashion. And of course, all of the allusions to this is highly sensitive and what's the best way to get you this information, does have an echo of those allegations of Mr. Kushner wanting to set up a secret back channel. Again, what I think is notable here is the pattern. These aren't a series of meetings, events, denials, obfuscations regarding China or regarding Canada or regarding Britain or regarding France. They all come back to Russia. And of course, the profound question is why, and that's the question that we need to answer. I have time for one last question. Yeah.
Could you please give us an update on the sanctions bill and give us an idea as to whether these events today will affect the path of that bill at all? So just bring us up to date.
Yeah. Well, we stand ready, I think, on a very bipartisan basis to pass the Senate bill overwhelmingly. I have no doubt if that came up for a vote tomorrow, it would pass overwhelmingly. Certainly these events, I think, give added urgency to doing exactly that. And I think it's very important to understand, in the context of that sanctions legislation, what is so disturbing and what is so concerning about these new public revelations and why Congress has to get to the bottom of it. The most serious risk to the country, I think, is that the Russians possess compromising information, what they call compromat, that can influence this president's conduct of American policy. The Russians know about this meeting. They were behind organizing the meeting. If there are other meetings that the Russians know about, if there are other interactions with the Trump campaign the Russians are aware of, that is something they can hold over the head of the President of the United States. And the American people need to know that our President is acting on their behalf and not acting because he has a fear that the Russians could disclose things that would harm him or his family. So I think it's an obligation for the Congress to get to the bottom of this and make sure that the President's policy, whether it's in Syria or Ukraine or vis-a-vis NATO or anything else, is only influenced by what's in the best interest of the country and not because the Russians are in possession of any material that they fear would become public.